Half of Europe died, and somehow that made certain people rich. Not a little richer. Dynasty rich. Here's the uncomfortable truth history doesn't like to say out loud. When a system collapses, wealth doesn't disappear. It changes hands. The Black Death didn't just kill peasants and merchants. It killed heirs. It erased entire bloodlines. It wiped out banks, landlords, and noble houses that had ruled for centuries. And when ownership dies, opportunity is reborn. Imagine waking up in a world where half your competitors are gone. Land has no owners. Businesses have no successors. Power has no clear next in line. Who do you think steps in? In this video, we're not focusing on the plague itself. We're following something far more revealing, the trail of money left behind by mass death. Because buried beneath the tragedy is a pattern that repeats in every crisis. From medieval pandemics, to financial crashes, and to modern global shutdowns. By the end of this video, you'll understand who actually got rich during the Black Death, how they did it, and why crises don't level society. They accelerate it. This isn't just medieval history, it's the blueprint of power. Let's begin. Every major crisis leaves behind the same illusion. That destruction means loss. That collapse means poverty. That's when everything breaks. Wealth disappears with it. But history tells a colder story. Wealth almost never dies in a crisis. It moves. When systems collapse, assets don't vanish into thin air. Land still exists. Gold still exists. Businesses still exist. What disappears are the owners. And when ownership collapses, redistribution begins. The Black Death is the clearest example of this rule. Half of Europe didn't just die, now it stopped competing. Fields were left without heirs. Shops were left without successors. Banks were left without partners. Entire noble families vanished from the economic map. The wealth was still there, it was just unclaimed. And whenever something becomes unclaimed, someone eventually claims it. You see the same mechanism centuries later. In 2008, trillions of dollars didn't evaporate. They shifted from over-leveraged homeowners to banks, funds, and investors with liquidity. During COVID, millions of small businesses disappeared. But total wealth didn't shrink. It concentrated. Crises don't press a reset button. They press a fast-forward button. They accelerate trends that were already there. They reward whoever can move while everyone else is frozen. That's the uncomfortable insight most people miss. The biggest advantage in a crisis isn't intelligence, it's positioning. If you have capital when others don't, connections when others lose them, or simply survive when others don't, your odds explode. The Black Death wasn't just a health disaster. It was the largest involuntary wealth transfer Europe had ever seen. And once you understand that rule, a far more disturbing question emerges. If wealth were moving, who exactly was standing in the right place to catch it? That's where the real story begins. To understand who won after the Black Death, you first have to understand just how completely Europe broke. This wasn't a recession. It wasn't a bad decade. It was demographic annihilation. In some regions, 40% of the population vanished. In others, more than half. That level of death didn't just reduce numbers, it rewired the entire economic system. Labor disappeared overnight. Fields went untilled. Workshops sat in silence. Suddenly, workers weren't replaceable. They were scarce. At the same time, land became abundant. Too abundant. Estates lost heirs. Manors stood empty. Entire villages had no legal owners left alive to claim them. Inheritance systems collapsed under their own rules. Medieval wealth depended on bloodlines, but the plague erased bloodlines faster than law could adapt. Banks suffered the same fate. Partnerships dissolved when partners died. Loans went unpaid when borrowers vanished. Financial networks didn't just shrink, they snapped. And here's the critical point most people miss. This wasn't a temporary shock, it was a structural reset. Feudalism depended on surplus labor. The plague destroyed that surplus. Aristocratic power depended on continuity. The plague destroyed continuity. You can recover from a bad harvest. You can recover from a war. But you don't quickly recover from a world where the social hierarchy itself no longer functions. And right here, this is the moment everything changes. Because when labor is scarce, land is ownerless, and institutions are weakened, the advantage shifts to those who can adapt faster than tradition. Here's the mini-hook most histories glide past. Imagine being one of the survivors with capital, connections, or legal knowledge in a world where half the rulebook no longer applies. Who do you think thrives in that environment? Not the old elites clinging to broken systems, but the people are willing to step into the vacuum. And nowhere was that vacuum more visible than in one city in northern Italy. A city where banking families collapsed, political offices emptied, and opportunity quietly waited for someone with timing. That city was Florence, and that's where a family named Medici enters the story. When people talk about the Medici, they talk about genius, vision, brilliance. But the real advantage came earlier. Before the power, before the art, before the empire, it came from timing. At the center of this moment stands one man, Giovanni de' Medici. Giovanni wasn't a noble. He wasn't the richest banker in Florence. He wasn't even the most ambitious. He was something far more dangerous in a crisis. He was early. By the late 1300s, Florence's financial world was collapsing. The great banking houses that once dominated Europe were bleeding out. The Bardi family were finished. The Peruzzi family were shadows of their former power. Plague deaths wiped out partners. Loan defaults wiped out capital. International branches closed as entire networks unraveled. Florence didn't lose banking. It lost bankers. And that distinction matters. In 1397, right as this financial vacuum opened, Giovanni founded the Medici Bank. Not during stability, not during growth, but during recovery. While old families tried to patch broken systems, Giovanni built inside the gaps they left behind. He didn't need to outcompete them, he just needed them gone. And they were. The Medici gained clients others no longer had the manpower to serve. They secured contracts, including managing papal finances, that would have been impossible in a crowded market. This is the insight that reframes everything. The Medici didn't rise because they were uniquely brilliant. They rose because the plague eliminated their rivals faster than talent ever could. Without the Black Death, the Medici might have remained a respectable upper-middle-tier Florentine family. Successful, comfortable, forgettable. Instead, they inherited a city desperate for stability and willing to elevate anyone who could provide it. Florence wasn't choosing the best bankers, it was choosing the survivors. And this pattern didn't stop at banking. Because while Florence's power shifted through money, another city to the north was exploiting the same chaos through land, inheritance, and titles. To understand how plague-era opportunity could turn into raw political dominance, we have to leave Florence behind and follow the trail to Milan. If Florence shows how money moves in a crisis, Milan shows how land and power move even faster. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it broke inheritance. Medieval wealth was built on bloodlines. Titles passed from father to son. Estates stayed intact as long as families survived. But the plague erased entire families at once. No heirs, no successors, no one is left to claim the land. And when that happened, the rules were brutally simple. Property reverted upward to whoever had the legal or military authority to seize it. This is where Milan's ruling dynasty stepped in. the House of Visconti didn't just survive the plague, they used it. As noble families around Milan died out, their lands didn't stay empty for long. They were absorbed, sometimes through the law, sometimes through pressure, sometimes through force. Bernabo Visconti expanded the Milanese territory aggressively, capitalizing on the constant churn of death and vacancy. But it was his successor who perfected the strategy. Gian Galeazzo Visconti understood something crucial. Plague did what wars normally took generations to achieve. War destroys land before you can rule it. The plague delivered land intact, already cleared of rivals. Through strategic marriages, legal claims, and relentless consolidation, Gian Galeazzo unified enough territory to be crowned the first Duke of Milan in 1395. In a stable world, that rise might have taken a century. In a world of mass death, it took a generation. This is the unsettling comparison. Wars reward the strongest armies, plagues reward the strongest position. When entire lineages vanish, power doesn't need conquest. It just needs proximity. And here's the moral question history rarely asks. If opportunity only exists because others died, is taking it ambition or exploitation? The Visconti didn't create the plague, but they understood its incentives, and they moved accordingly. This pattern wasn't unique to Milan. It was repeating across Europe. And across the Channel, it would quietly reshape an entire kingdom, not through dukes or dynasties, but through families no one expected to rise. To see that transformation, we need to go to England. While Italy's winners wore famous names, England's winners were quieter. They didn't build banks. They didn't crown themselves dukes. They bought land. And they did it when the price of power collapsed. One of the clearest examples is the Paston family. Before the plague, the Pastons were modest landowners in Norfolk, educated, ambitious, but nowhere near the aristocracy. Then the Black Death rewrote the market. Neighboring estates lost heirs. Manors sat empty. Land flooded the market at prices that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. The Pastons didn't rush in with swords. They came with contracts. They bought land cheaply. They used courts to secure claims. They leveraged legal literacy in a world where many old nobles had simply disappeared. And here's the human detail that makes this real. In the Paston letters, we see family members arguing over rents, worrying about lawsuits, complaining about repairs to leaky roofs and broken mills. This wasn't abstract wealth. It was lived-in power. Over time, land turned into income. Income turned into influence. Influence turned into political access. By the time England entered the Wars of the Roses, families like the Pastons weren't spectators. They were stakeholders. This is the insight most people miss. England's later political structure, it's a powerful parliament, its landed gentry class, it's an uneasy balance between the crown and nobility. Rests on foundations poured during the plague years. The Black Death didn't just weaken the old aristocracy. It created a new ruling layer beneath it. Not titled kings, not ancient dukes, but property-owning families who understood law, leverage, and timing. And this quiet rise wasn't limited to England, because while land was reshaping power inland, something very different was happening along Europe's northern coast. Out there, survival depended on ships, grain, and supply lines. To see how trade turned catastrophe into profit, we need to follow the money north, to the Baltic and the merchants of the Hanseatic world. While land reshaped power inland, trade decided survival along Europe's northern coast. This is where the story turns cold. The Hanseatic League wasn't a country. It wasn't an empire. It was a network, a loose cartel of merchant cities stretching across the Baltic and North Sea. And during the Black Death, that network became priceless. As plague waves rolled through Europe, food production collapsed. Labor shortages crippled farms. Cities began to starve. Grain wasn't just a commodity anymore. It was life. The Hanseatic merchants understood this faster than anyone else. They bought grain from regions less affected by the plague and sold it to devastated cities at massive markups. They controlled the timber needed to rebuild homes and ships. They monopolized salt, the single most important preservative in a world without refrigeration. This wasn't greed, it was logistics. While southern trade networks fractured under death and debt, the Hanseatic League doubled down on ships, warehouses, and routes. Others went bankrupt. They expanded fleets. Others lost manpower. They leveraged coordination. Here's the modern parallel that makes this click. Think of the Hanseatic League as a medieval Amazon. They didn't create demand. The crisis did that. They simply owned the infrastructure that could meet it. When supply chains collapse, whoever controls what still works doesn't just survive, they dictate terms. That's the insight. We tend to think power comes from production. But in crises, power comes from distribution. The Hanseatic cities didn't need to grow more grain. They just needed to decide where it went. And that decision translated directly into wealth, political influence, and long-term dominance in Northern Europe. But even the Hanseatic League had one limitation. Merchants die, partners die, families die. Which raises a dangerous question. What happens when wealth flows into institutions that don't depend on heirs at all? To answer that, we need to look at the one organization that expanded relentlessly during the plague, not through trade or war, but through fear, faith, and final wills. It's time to talk about the church. Every winner we've seen so far had one shared weakness. They relied on people. Families need heirs, banks need partners, merchants need successors. The plague killed all of those. But one institution was built to survive death itself. The Catholic Church had no inheritance problem, no bloodlines, no succession crises. When priests died, others replaced them. When monks perished, the institution remained. And in a world obsessed with death, that permanence became incredibly valuable. The Black Death didn't just destroy bodies, it terrified minds. People didn't just fear dying, they feared dying unforgiven. So they did what humans always do under existential panic. They made economic decisions driven by fear. Landowners donated estates to monasteries in exchange for prayers and burial rites. Merchants gifted vineyards, mills, and livestock, hoping to secure salvation for their families. In some regions, entire villages passed into church hands because no heirs survived to contest them. This wasn't a conquest, it was a transfer. Quiet, legal, permanent. Orders like the Cistercians and Benedictines emerged from the plague, owning vast stretches of farmland. They collected rents. They ran mills. They became some of the largest landlords in Europe. Here's the uncomfortable insight. In times of mass death, people invest in what feels eternal. That's why the church functioned like a medieval safe haven, not unlike how modern investors flee to gold, government bonds, or real estate during crises. Different centuries, same instinct. The church didn't need to ask for land. It simply waited. And fear delivered it. But there's a final twist most histories gloss over. While elites consolidated wealth through institutions, something very different was happening at the bottom. Because for the first time in centuries, ordinary workers suddenly had leverage. And their quiet victory tells a very different story. To understand that brief reversal of power, we need to shift our focus away from dynasties and institutions and toward the people who survived. Up to this point, every winner we've talked about had power, capital, or institutions behind them. But the Black Death created one group of winners no one expected. Ordinary workers. Before the plague, life for most Europeans was brutally simple. Too many people, too little land, Wages are pushed down by endless competition. If you were a peasant or a laborer, you were replaceable. Then half the workforce disappeared. Suddenly, fields had no one to harvest them. Workshops had no one to train. Manors had no one to serve them. And for the first time in generations, labor had leverage. Wages rose sharply. In some regions, they doubled. Workers negotiated better terms or walked away entirely. Guilds, once closed and exclusive, opened their doors. Apprentices became masters far earlier than tradition allowed. Mobility, real mobility, almost briefly existed. Landlords panicked. In England, elites passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, trying to legally force wages back down to pre-plague levels. It didn't work, because laws don't override supply and demand. For a moment in history, survival itself became bargaining power. But here's the key insight. This wasn't a revolution built to last. It was a window. As populations slowly recovered, elites adapted. Institutions reasserted control. Wages stagnated again. The system bent, but it didn't break. And that raises a question that cuts to the heart of this entire story. If even the biggest labor advantage in medieval history only lasted a generation, what does that tell us about who ultimately wins when crises end? Because when the dust settles, power doesn't stay with those who benefit briefly. It consolidates with those who can endure. And that brings us to the final lesson of the Black Death. The one that connects medieval Europe to every modern crisis we think we understand. Let's bring it all together. By now, the pattern should be impossible to ignore. The Black Death didn't destroy wealth, it rearranged it. Banking dynasties rose because rivals vanished. Noble houses expanded because heirs didn't survive. Merchants dominated because supply chains mattered more than production. Institutions grew because they outlived individuals. Workers gained leverage, but only briefly. Different winners, same mechanism. And that mechanism didn't end in the 14th century. In 2008, the global financial system collapsed. Homes were lost, careers ended, entire industries froze, but total wealth didn't disappear. It consolidated into banks deemed too big to fail, into funds that bought distressed assets, into institutions positioned to survive the fallout. During COVID, the pattern repeated again. Small businesses closed permanently, millions lost jobs, yet global billionaire wealth surged by trillions. Different tools, same outcome. Crises don't level the playing field, they tilt it. They don't reward effort, they reward positioning. They don't create fairness, they accelerate whatever inequalities already exist. That's the lesson the Black Death leaves behind. It didn't just kill half of Europe, it reshaped the world that followed. It helped create the Renaissance. It rewired political power in England. It strengthened trade networks in the North. It concentrated land, capital, and influence into fewer hands. Out of devastation came mobility. Out of chaos came consolidation. Out of collapse came new elites. And here's the thought that should stay with you. The next crisis won't ask who deserves to win. It will ask who is ready. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does keep testing the same rule. If you understand how wealth behaves when systems break, you understand how power is built. If this changed how you see history, or the world we're living in now, subscribe, because the past isn't dead. It's still deciding who comes out on top.